So I'm Pascale. As Lee noted, I have a confused background, but I've worked with Northern Land Council, Cape York Land Council, and now with NQLC. I suppose before I start, I'd like to extend my thanks for your audience today, and particularly to Nick and Julie for their investment into these important opportunities to build our community of practice. So I've written you all a letter. I sat down to write a presentation about managing ethno-historic materials, and I sort of diligently considered the various codes of ethics for research, and I thought about the implications about when materials are developed for litigated proceedings, and etc. But my draft fell totally flat, and it seemed entirely beside the point. And what emerged in the end were actually a set of my own reflections, questions really, that arise from my experience working with ethno-historic collections in native title rep bodies. We enter these libraries of genealogies and field maps and theses and sort of shelved and cobwebbed human stories. And I think the weighty questions aren't procedural. I think they're questions about the relationships we form with claimants, with informants and the descendants of informants, and with the communities of provenance. Peter Sutton once kindly said to me, reminded me that no one can own information. Ethno-historic material is information that we actually hold in trust. And I think I might add to that, based on my experience in the day-to-day of rep bodies, it's information that we manage, and so information that we control. And NTRBs use this information with the best of intentions to assist people to exercise the land rights that their communities have so resiliently preserved, despite the brutal atrocities upon which this nation was founded, atrocities perpetrated by and as a consequence of the fatal complicity of agencies of government. We all here know this history well, but I take Kevin's point earlier about what actually needs to happen before we can reconcile our past. We uncover accounts of massacres and forcible removals in nearly every region we research. But does this frame sufficiently contextualise our work? Does the lived experience of the past and present subjects of the anthropological records and the research underscore the multitude of small decisions that we make each day about how we manage these materials? I think the decisions we make in rep bodies congeal to shape the ongoing lived experience of claimants throughout the course of native title claims. I don't know if that worked. It did. As I said, it's just so you look up there instead of here. So a couple of years back, I was in a meeting organising the provision of a set of genealogies developed for a determined claim to a PBC. The construction of the native title holding group relied heavily on upper generations developed by Tyndale. Claim group membership was said to be based on descent from named ancestors. No surprises there, all very familiar. But in respect of certain people, adoption was at issue, descent was challenged, and information about the biological genitors of certain individuals' forebears had been a factor in determining who was in, who was out. Sadly, Peter Sutton's family of polity was not in the frame of this snapshot. What was in the frame were Tyndale's notations of F1, F2, I apologise for my language, half-caste, suddenly deemed relevant to the conclusions of the anthropologist in relation to the claim group. Working through my predecessor's reasoning, a thought struck me. I'm not being an anthropologist in this moment. I feel like a professional racial profiler. And I felt deeply stained. With utmost respect for the great man and his work, this claim had a chronic case of tinnitus. And now I had been infected. But worse, the PBC was at risk of catching the virus. The problem on this day was that those notations had made their infectious way, into the genealogies that we were to provide the PBC. The PBC, of course, comprised of people whose forebears, head circumferences and nasal depths, Birdsall and Tyndall with their wives had so meticulously and absurdly measured. And I wonder, do we breathe life into these informational artefacts when we rely on them and when we validate them as simple records? As you know, those measurements and the notations were recorded along with those eerie mugshots on individual data cards, copies of which are now held for equally invasive examinations by us, the new age but absolutely enlightened experts on these past and present subjects of our research. And I wonder, as our NTRB materials management policies turn their impersonal focus to these weird and sad records, are we complicit? Do we echo the injustices inherent in those early projects of our brutal state? Do claimants experience us as disinterested agencies of government, controlling information about them, intruding to collect data for our bigger but incredibly important projects, dislocating the information from the individual, and so disenfranchising people of their personal intellectual property? But let's get back to the meeting. We're discussing how to provide the genealogies to the PBC. Do we leave the racist notations in? Do we censor them out? Does the PBC have some right or authority to see all the bases upon which the claim was framed? Is it right for us to conceal the records? Do the living descendants of each person subject to a notation have a right to decide which particular records pertaining to their antecedents are shared with the PBC? This discussion started to look like a minefield loaded with scenarios in which our own failures, our own disciplinary failures, were embarrassingly examined. I once had a very unpleasant conversation with a claimant. It was my job to explain the conclusions of the experts' connection research at that time. But the claimant was outraged. I had not done my research. I was a terrible anthropologist. This claimant had Tyndale, whom, apparently, he kept in a dog-eared but alarmingly thick bundle of papers which he was currently waving centimetres from my face. I have Tyndale's GPS coordinates, he raged. I got them off the internet. You must have seen them, but you don't want to know because you anthropologists have already decided to write my family out of this claim. Well, where to start? How did we come to this? Do we anthropologists share part responsibility for a situation where the native title research process and NTRB staff, anthropological staff, are so far removed from the people subject to research that we can't have a sensible conversation about these materials. Perhaps we haven't invested sufficiently in building sophisticated conversations about the materials with the communities of provenance. Perhaps we haven't made enough time to talk about the context in which the materials were generated, what they do and don't mean, and how we can and can't use them in research. Maybe we need to work harder to collaborate with the relevant communities on the management and use of ethnohistoric materials. I was in a meeting with a few claimants not long back. It was my first time meeting members of this claim group, and the meeting was not 10 minutes old. What I'm trying to say is, I'm pretty sure that I hadn't yet put my foot in it. Tensions were high though, and I very carefully asked the senior old man in the meeting a very unobtrusive question. But still, his niece jumped at the opportunity to block. "We don't give anthropologists information anymore," she proclaimed. "They took all the information from this old man for the last claim. They put it in a report and other people got it, and now those people use his stories to claim our country." Inwardly, I thought, if you want a positive determination of native title, you might not have a choice but to share some information with an anthropologist. But I think that raises a whole set of questions about how consent occurs in this framework that I don't even want to go to today. But the old man appeared quite irritated at his niece, and I caught his eye across the table under his battered hat. He was refreshingly human in the context of the sterile meeting room and the intractable hostility of his niece. He said, "We don't like native title. I want to delete this claim." And he had expertly turned the tables, because native title was the record now, one that could be deleted. It was entirely disassociated from him and from his connection to his country. He looked deeply tired, and I wondered if for him the benefit of a determination was simply not worth the cost of the research. The question that arises from that story for me is, what steps can we take in the management of the information that we hold in trust to reframe this relationship between claimants and native title anthropologists? I don't know if my questions resonate with you, and to be honest, after Nick's gaffe yesterday, I was worried that I might come across as a woke wannabe. But thinking about that old man in the meeting and my angry friend who carried the heavy weight of Tyndale in his paper bundle, and thinking about these people who found themselves abruptly inspected and directed to stare into that impersonal camera lens, I just felt compelled to acknowledge their experience and to reflect on our position in it. And I think it was Julie who said, as a passing comment at our discussion group table yesterday, that if you want to collaborate, you have to let go of your usual positions. And I wonder if reminding ourselves to take a position of self-reflection could help shape an improved relational collaboration with the people who are subject of and who are subject to our records. Thank you.